For generations, the reaching skyline of New York City has been a symbol of man's constant effort in reshaping the earth, a symbol of new planning and new building and new patterns of living. Beyond the skyline, in New York's expressways, in its bridges, beaches, and parks, in its steady elimination of slums, lie the principles of one of the world's great physical planners, Robert Moses. Today, at the Long Island State Park Commission headquarters in Babylon, New York, one of his 5 offices, Robert Moses discusses his worldwide work with his friend, the distinguished landscape architect and a designer of the United Nations Plaza, Gilmore D. Clarke.
Bob, you've done more than anyone else to raise city planning to a science, as evidenced by the fact that you have improved the face of New York City and of the state of New York. All this is evidenced by the encomiums we see here on the walls of this room in the form of medals, honorary degrees, and other evidence.
Well, as far as the encomiums are concerned, nobody would ever frame and hang brickbats on the walls. And naturally, you put on the stuff that's flattering and not the other things. I don't believe that city planning or planning applied to any area of government has reached the dignity and importance of a science. The tendency has been to attempt to elevate it into a science so that people who didn't get along fast enough in the old professions could find a new one where they could advance more rapidly. There's nothing new in that. And on the other hand, there is such a thing as planning. There's always been people who made plans. They made physical plans, they made financial plans, they made family plans since the beginning of time, the beginning of recorded history. And the notion that this is a new science that suddenly sprang from the brow of Jove or whatever it sprang from is rubbish. Now, at best, it's a kind of amalgamation of engineering and architecture and finance. Finance is a tremendously important phase of the whole thing. My experience has been that many of the people, by no means all, who call themselves planners, are people who make pretty pictures. They draw things. They present a plausible and often melodramatic program, but they're not people that get anything done. And many of them are entirely satisfied when they've finished the plan, when they've announced the plan. That's the end of it. Because they don't have the stick-to-itiveness, they don't have the guts, they don't have the ability to combat, to fight in the forum to get things accomplished.
And their plans go on the shelf and gather dust.
That's right. Their plans generally are on the shelf. And the result is that you have an enormous accumulation of schemes of one kind or another. Many of them are valid, theoretically valid. But what is a valid plan? You get a man who looks ahead and says he can look ahead 100 years. I don't think anybody can look ahead 100 years in this country in the field of physical planning, city growth, metropolitan growth, regional growth, whatever you want to call it.
Bob, I've heard you speak about limited objectives many times. I suppose that what you mean is that you prefer to plan for, say, within a period of 4 or 5 years, whereas the ivory tower boys that you speak about talk about 25 to 30 years.
Of course, I am a limited objective boy. I couldn't get anything done, nor could the people that are working with me, on any other basis. But on the other hand, it's ridiculous to say that things we're working on don't show any imagination, that they're all without vision and without regard to the future, and that they're just these immediate, showy, immediate things. Now, you take a thing like a project like Jones Beach, for example. Well, we've been at Jones Beach since 1924. That's a long time. The original plan is no different from the present plan. We've carried out about maybe 70% of it, 75% of it, in the course of 35 years. That's how long it's taken. And it just happens to be our good fortune or luck or whatever you may call it, that the people who originally conceived the idea are still around. They're extant. And maybe a little groggy, but they're still here.
Bob, no one that I know of has ever carried out such tremendous public works programs as you have. And in so doing, you invite criticism. I'd like to have you tell me something about that.
Well, I don't know that there's very much to say. Yes, I can say as a generalization that there is no big program of any kind, no physical program, whether it's parks or highways or bridges or whatever it may be, that doesn't start with an enthusiastic minority. Now, if you're unhappy in a minority, and most people are in this country, you don't go any further. You assume that if you're in a minority, you must be wrong, because that's the democratic process. In any event, most people feel uncomfortable in a minority, and some of us don't. I've never felt that way about it, because all big programs start with minorities who become majorities in the end. And in the process, there's a tremendous amount of criticism. Some of it is justified, some of it unjustified. Some of it's constructive, and much of it is uninformed, and a good deal of it, unfortunately, is strictly malicious. Some of it comes from people who have nothing to do but criticize. They don't have any other talent. You find that out of a dozen people who like something in public improvements, one will write a letter about it or say something about it. They don't like something, 11 out of 12 will tell you that. That seems to be in human nature. But as to sensitiveness, why, if you become very sensitive, why you become useless. Can't take it physically, mentally, or any other way. And those of us who have been around for quite a while, and don't forget, we have survived somehow or other in public office, don't get excited about criticism. We try to be reasonable about it. We try to understand that if you have to move a lot of people out of the way of a big housing project or slum clearance project like, say, Lincoln Square, whatever the objective may be, or out of the way of an approach to a bridge, that a lot of them are not going to like it. Many of them are misinformed. Many of them, in the end, come around to feel that you've done them a great service. And but in the process, if there is somebody to excite them, to steam them up, somebody that is a ringleader, you get a terrific amount of criticism. And newspapers join in it, churches join in it, and there it is. And that frightens the elected offices. They're scared. And even those that have commissioned you to do the job run out on you, or they weaken. And they always have the same phrase that they use. I've heard it ad nauseam for the last 30-odd years. They say, you don't have to be elected. My stock reply to them is, you don't have to be either. But that's your picture.
Dr. Parr, the distinguished director of the American Museum of Natural History, posed a question for you when he asked, how do you reconcile your attempt to create a civic pride in a local community with a definite policy of observing public cautiousness in public architecture? What was your reply to that?
Well, I pointed out to him, first of all, that he's an ichthyologist. He's a fish man. And I don't recognize him as an architect or an authority on planning or public works or anything of that kind. He's a darn good man on fish. Well, I don't know much about fish, and I like fishing, but I'm not an expert. And I pointed out to him that his theories about what he would do if he were in a position to do something about architecture, public structures, left me very cold indeed. The fact of the matter is that in my opinion, let's leave out the fact, just say that in my opinion, a public official who's responsible for the architecture of buildings, plans, subdivisions, the architecture that goes with arterial improvements. There's a great deal of architecture in them, as you know now. And landscaping, all that sort of thing, should be progressive, of course. Should have an open mind. Should use new materials if they're any good. But he shouldn't be the forerunner. He shouldn't be the avant-garde fellow. He's got no right to do that with public funds.
Bob, I remember some time ago that you wrote a letter to someone whose name I've forgotten concerning real estate that was to be purchased in connection with the Harlem Ship Canal Bridge. The letter was about 3-4 pages long, and your reply was nuts.
Well, that's true, and I remember the man.
Is that the length of your usual answer?
No, but the reason that man, I know exactly who he was. I replied to him was because he was a very close friend and a great adherent and advisor of Mayor LaGuardia's. And he was important enough to answer. There's no reason why I had to write him very politely or at great length. Letter writing is something of an art, has to be cultivated. So is talking. And that doesn't mean you do it gratuitously, or you do it just for fun, or you do it sadistically, or you do it to be mean, or to be a smart aleck. It means that it's a weapon. You've got to fight for the things that you're interested in. You have to explain things. And certainly the last thing in the world is to assume you can fall back in this country on the laws of libel or slander. All the good lawyers are working for the other fellows.
How is it that you get along with people in order to gain your manifold objectives?
Well, I don't want to pose as an authority on that, or as anybody who sets any standards or has anything to contribute. I'm not the Lord Chesterfield or the Marquis of Queensberry or Mr. Hoyle or anything of that kind. And I suppose to the extent that I have any reputation in that field, it's the reputation of not being a diplomat, not being a striped pants boy. Perfectly obvious that in order to get anywhere in public work, you have to have friends, you have to have supporters, you have to have a first-class staff. That's even more important. And you have to have a certain amount of reasonably steady public support, which is manifest in the press and by whatever other means, by whatever means public support is manifested. And on the other hand, you can afford to have a certain number of enemies. They're not necessarily fatal or conclusive, and they're inevitable anyway. Now, some people have more and some have less. I'm frank to say that there's nothing in my limited experience that indicates to me that you can get any programs of consequence, of any great size, measured geographically or financially or any other way, done by diplomacy, by sleight of hand, by mirrors. You hear about people who do them, but I don't run into very many of them. And the people who say that you can accomplish things without friction, without trouble, are rarely ever found when you need them. They're under the furniture, or they've turned up some kind of a side alley. They've left you. And there's nothing that indicates to me that life is, in these United States, if you're going to get anywhere, is anything but a struggle. I don't say that to enlist sympathy at all. I kind of like it.
Bob, your training was principally in the area of law and economics. How does it happen that with that background, you've gotten into this big construction program and large-scale planning?
I always intended to go into public work, and I took a lot of political science work in college when I was at Yale, and I took a degree in law at Oxford because that was the only thing approaching what I wanted to do that I could take a degree in. I didn't think it was worthwhile just hang around and not not take a degree. I got a doctor's degree in political science, but I don't know how much those things helped. I don't know whether they did. The first thing you've got to do in the circles in which I move is to hide those degrees. If you have a Phi Beta Kappa key, put it in your wife's sewing box. Don't wear it.
Well, doesn't that speak pretty well for the basic, broad, general education rather than highly specialized areas?
I think if you went on a tramp steamer and bummed your way around the world, you'd do just as well. Maybe better.
You hold some very definite views about statues and statuary in cities across the country. Tell us about some of the New York statues.
Well, you know the problem there. Art is as good as the Art Commission, and the Park Commissioner will also vote. Now, the most hideous monstrosities that we have in New York, and we have plenty of them, date back to a period when they represented the taste of that period. It's futile to try to criticize that taste in terms of the taste of today. A different set of people, and other customs, other laws, and there it is. Once one of these things is established, you never can get rid of it. You take that fellow congressman downtown in New York with his finger upraised who got the postal increase for the postal employees. That's one of the worst statues in New York, but you could never get rid of it. As long as there's a postal service, he's going to be there. As to recent memorials and monuments, I think we've done pretty well in New York.
You've been interested in a great many cities outside of the city of New York. I'm thinking particularly of Flint, where we worked together.
Now, the interesting thing about Flint is that there are two interesting things. First of all, it's a city that has leadership. It's largely industrial leadership. It's a General Motors town. It's primarily a Chevrolet town with some Buick overtones. And the president of General Motors, the last recent president, lived there, and the people who made Flint came up with the automotive industry, dating way back when they were making axles and things for wagons and carts before the internal combustion engine got going. And they furnished real leadership, and they're the leaders today. Some of them survived 50 years. Mr. Mott, for example, is I recall it, the largest single stockholder in General Motors. He's 83 or 84 years old. He's still as lively as a cricket. And he's interested in the Civic Center. He's interested in having a cultural center, having a branch of Michigan University and Opera House, running track, Philharmonic, all the other things that you can think of. And they have provided real leadership in that town. And when that group of top industrialists and the labor leaders also get together, they decide what will be done. And it is done. I don't say there's been a complete lack of political leadership, but it has been a town that has acknowledged leaders, and they get together and decide to do something, they do it. Now, it's not true in most American cities. True in some new cities in Texas. It's true in some cities in California. It's notably not true in the eastern part of the United States. And if you get a group of people like that together, they can pretty nearly decide whether the community will be genuinely progressive or not. That's the lesson of Flint, if there is any lesson.
Suppose we jump from a relatively small city to a large one. Take, for example, the city of Los Angeles. That's spread all over the place with no central area. What would you do in such a situation?
I don't know. I wouldn't want to have the job. I only know about it as secondhand through the various people who've made surveys and studies of arterial improvements and water supply and so forth and so on. Some of them are Eastern firms, some of them firms from other parts of the country. They've got plenty of talent out there. The point about Los Angeles is that what makes it so tough is that the city has no core. It's got no central core. And contrary to the belief of a great many so-called planners and experts in the field, a city does have to have a central core. It has to have a place where there are high values and where there's fine business and there are theaters and all that sort of thing, tall buildings. And that's where you collect your taxes. Now, if you don't have that, and you just have a spreading blight, or at least you have a spreading population, and spread over an enormous area, and the cost of maintaining it is simply prodigious. Take the additional number of policemen you need, and firemen, and street cleaners, and inspectors, and all that kind of thing. It's a city without any heart. And I don't mean in the sentimental sense, but I mean in the physical sense. And I don't know how you deal with a thing of that kind. A great many people have moved there from all over the country. They don't have their roots down very deep. They haven't been there long enough to establish very many connections. I would say that it's probably the most difficult city in the United States to make progress in when it comes to planning. But I don't know anything about it at first hand.
You've been to Western Europe rather recently. What about the problems over there, particularly with respect to the devastated areas?
Well, I've only been over once, and I went over for a short time to look at some things for General Clay in Germany. I wouldn't have believed, looking at the ruin of a place like Essen, that it could be rebuilt in the way that it has been in a relatively short time. But their primary job has been to rebuild. Now, it's true that they've rebuilt on a permanent basis and with modern materials and on the basis of new plans. But I was astonished after the war to find the same professors, the same planning professors, in their cutaways and Prince Albert coats with the big long pointers. In Berlin, I met the head planner. I met the corresponding fellow in a couple of other places in Germany. They had the same old grandiose plans. They don't have any money to carry them out. And that's the trouble. In England, for example, they don't need us as technicians. They invite us over to flatter us and all that kind of thing, but they have just as good technicians as we've got any day. They just haven't got the money. And when you figure that an expressway today costs anywhere from $1 million to $15 million a mile, 1 mile in the Bronx on either side of the Grand Boulevard and Concourse, a half mile on either side, is run to $16 million. That's from waiting too long. But they don't have $16 million to spend, not on 1 mile or on 16 miles. They just don't have it. That isn't any lack of ambition, that isn't any lack of pride, and it's just that they don't have the money, they can't afford it. I think that's the story of Western Europe.
Bob, we've talked about 2 cities, namely Los Angeles and Flint. What about the other communities over the United States that are going to require very special planning problems because of the tremendous increase in population?
Naturally, there will have to be a tremendous number of public improvements of all kinds to meet that population demand. Just take housing, for example, and schools and roads and all the other things. Now, the people demand these things, and they also demand more and more facilities and improvements and a better life, and at the same time, they don't want to pay for it. So you've got that sort of a standoff there in a way. You have people who are the same people who on Monday demand all sorts of things, and Tuesday, as members of taxpayers' organizations and whatnot, denounce them. I don't know what the answer to that is, excepting that we do have to anticipate a very large increase in population, and therefore a great many additional public works. Now, some of them can wait, others can't wait. Parks are a good illustration. A case where land that's vacant ought to be acquired now, before it's built on, before it becomes too expensive to use for park recreation purposes, too many people to move, too many houses to demolish, too much opposition. Other things can wait, but the longer you wait, the more expensive these things become.
I've heard you many times quote Huxley with respect to the great objective in life, and where he said the great end of life is not knowledge but action. I appreciate your comments on that philosophy.
Well, I couldn't agree with it more. Here's a man who was a philosopher, and of course, in a sense, he was the voice of Darwin. He supplied the eloquence that Darwin lacked. And but after thinking it all over very late in life, he came to that conclusion. I think it's a sound conclusion. That doesn't mean that there isn't plenty of room in the world for philosophers, but all we need is doers. People can get things done, and not people who just talk about them. I think it's a wonderful conclusion.
Bob, from whom have you learned the most? From the well-intentioned reformers or from the politicians?
Well, I'm an emancipated graduate reformer, and as to which group I've learned more from, I've learned much more from the politicians than I have from the reformers. Reformers don't, as a group, are not a very attractive group of people. As you get older, you recognize that. They're too self-righteous. They feel that they have the call. I never felt that I had the call. I often think these fellows that get these long-distance telephone messages from on high just have a wrong number. On the other hand, you take politicians, and I take as an illustration Governor Smith. All that I know that's of any practical value about the basic things in politics, I learned from him. And he certainly wasn't a reformer in the ordinary sense, and he certainly wasn't an uplifter in the ordinary sense, and he wasn't a social worker. He was a man who liked people, and he was ambitious also. He had a way of getting at the heart of things and popularizing very abstruse questions so that the average fellow could understand them. And there was a tremendous human quality, humor about the man. And I figure that my graduation, commencement, whatever you want to call it, and getting away from the reformers is when I met Smith. I learned from him and many others of his group what I consider to be the basic fundamental things. And they were never people, any of them, who said that they believed in principles and not in people. They believed basically in people. Their loyalties ran to people. They were loyal people. I think that's the fundamental thing about the old-fashioned political leader, not necessarily all the fellows we have today. But the best of the old leaders had that quality.
It's getting late, and I suppose we've come to the end of this very interesting experience, certainly for me. Let me ask you one question. Why do you remain in this exasperating and combative work?
That's rather hard to answer. I suppose it's partly due to the basic interest in the work itself, as you enjoy doing the work and you're willing to take the headaches that go with it. It's hard to take the headaches, work that you don't like. I've never had that experience, but I've been told it's so. And I suppose that to some extent it's lack of, I won't say lack of anything. I think to some extent it's an instinct for the jugular, as somebody said. I mean, you either like a fight or you don't. And if you don't like a fight, you don't belong in that game. And finally, I think it's maybe this is the most important thing. It's just sheer stubbornness. You get into something and you don't let go. I think that's it.
The NBC television network has presented a conversation with Robert Moses and Gilmore D. Clarke, the distinguished landscape architect. The program was filmed in the office of Mr. Moses at the Long Island State Park Commission headquarters in Babylon, New York. This program was produced as a special project by the NBC television network.